I'm Judy Woodruff. On the NewsHour tonight, high-stakes trade.
Major funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by
Babbel, a language app that teaches real-life conversations in a new language like Spanish, French, German, Italian, and more. Babbel's 10 to 15-minute lessons are available as an app or online. More information on babbel.com.
Consumer Cellular understands that not everyone needs an unlimited wireless plan. Our U.S.-based customer service reps can help you choose a plan based on how much you use your phone. Nothing more, nothing less. To learn more, go to consumercellular.tv.
financial services firm Raymond James, Leidos,
and by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, supporting science, technology, and improved economic performance and financial literacy in the 21st century.
Carnegie Corporation of New York, supporting innovations in education, democratic engagement, and the advancement of international peace and security at carnegie.org. And with the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
President Trump had tough words for China today as trade talks with a delegation from Beijing got underway. The president said China had been, quote, spoiled by lenient U.S. trade policies for too long and vowed that the U.S. would no longer be, quote, ripped off. We'll talk with an expert on U.S.-China relations right after the news summary. In the day's other news, President Trump pivoted from words of praise to threats of military force against North Korea. Meeting with the head of NATO at the White House, the president said he hoped that next month's summit with Kim Jong-un would go forward. Pyongyang has threatened to cancel the meeting if the U.S. insists that it give up its entire nuclear arsenal. Mr. Trump suggested that if Kim does not make a deal, he could meet a fate similar to Libya's leader Muammar Gaddafi. After giving up his nuclear program in 2003, Gaddafi was deposed and then killed in a rebellion backed by the U.S. in 2011.
If you look at that model with Gaddafi, that was a total decimation. We went in there to beat him. Now, that model would take place if we don't make a deal, most likely. But if we make a deal, I think Kim Jong-un is going to be very, very happy.
The North has suspended talks with South Korea for continuing military drills with the U.S. North Korea's head negotiator blasted the South today as, quote, ignorant and incompetent. The CIA has a new director, Gina Haspel. She was confirmed by the Senate today in a 54-45 vote. She faced opposition from Democrats for her role in harsh interrogation of detainees at so-called CIA black sites. But today, 6 Democrats voted in her favor, and 2 Republicans, Rand Paul and Jeff Flake, opposed her. Haspel will be the first woman to lead the CIA. Today marks 1 year since Special Counsel Robert Mueller began investigating ties between President Trump's associates and the Russian government. In that time, Mueller's team has indicted 19 people and secured 5 guilty pleas, some from former high-ranking Trump officials. The president today used Twitter to rail against Mueller's probe, repeating his charge that it's, quote, the greatest witch hunt in American history. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, an Ebola outbreak has spread from rural areas to a city of over 1 million people. The country said it had confirmed the first case of the virus in the city of Bandaka. The World Health Organization has rushed thousands of doses of an experimental vaccine to Congo. 23 people have died there since the outbreak began last week.
Urban Ebola is a very different phenomenon to rural Ebola because we know that people in urban areas can have far more contacts. So that means that urban Ebola can result in an exponential increase in cases in a way that rural Ebola struggles to do.
Congo's health ministry says that it will start administering the vaccine early next week. Back in this country, a violent eruption of Hawaii's Kilauea volcano shook the Big Island today. It has been spewing ash and blocks of so-called ballistic rocks, said to be the size of microwaves. Today, the plume reached 30,000 feet high. Officials warned of dangerous driving conditions and urged residents to shelter in place. On Wall Street today, the Dow Jones Industrial Average lost 55 points to close at 24,714. The Nasdaq fell 16 points, and the S&P 500 slipped 2. Still to come on the NewsHour, what's at stake in the trade talks between the U.S. and China? The American birth rate falls to a 30-year low. Inside Yemen, where war is tearing apart the country's healthcare system, and much more. Prospects for averting an all-out trade war dim today as the second round of negotiations between the U.S. and China kicked off here in Washington. As Yamiche Al-Sindor reports, both President Trump and the Chinese appear to be digging in their heels.
We have been ripped off by China, an evacuation of wealth like no country has ever seen before.
President Trump railed against existing trade deals today. He appeared pessimistic about talks aimed to head off a looming trade war.
China's become very spoiled. The European Union has become very spoiled. Other countries have become very spoiled because they always got 100% of whatever they wanted from the United States. But we can't allow that to happen anymore.
President Trump said conversations with Chinese President Xi Jinping have changed since initial talks earlier this month. Today, the president met with Xi's top economic advisor, Vice Premier Liu He. Hours before the president spoke, his economic advisor, Larry Kudlow, laid out the U.S.'s intentions.
We have requested that China change their trading practices, which are unfair and in many ways illegal.
There is word the Trump administration is demanding a $200 billion cut in Chinese trade surplus and more protections for U.S. intellectual property. Last month, President Trump threatened to slap up to $150 billion of punitive tariffs onto more than 1,300 Chinese exports. In turn, China took direct aim at the U.S.'s farm industry. It threatened 25% tariffs on soybeans, along with cars and aircrafts, totaling $50 billion. China's commerce spokesperson said today in Beijing his country did not want to see an increase in tensions.
Regarding the visit, we do not want to see the escalation of trade frictions between China and the U.S. We will resolutely safeguard our own interests, and we will not trade our core interests.
China has countered by asking the U.S. to lift a ban on giant Chinese telecom equipment maker ZTE Corporation. The company halted operations after the U.S. government restricted U.S. companies from selling manufacturing components to ZTE last month. It was caught illegally shipping goods to Iran and North Korea. On Sunday, the president tweeted he would help ZTE, quote, get back into business fast, and added, too many jobs in China lost. His tweet drew bipartisan outrage as critics slammed President Trump for helping Chinese jobs before American jobs. Today, the president defended himself and said China's president asked him to look into it.
They also buy a large portion of their parts for the phones that they make, and they're the fourth largest company in terms of that industry. They buy those parts from the United States. That's a lot of business.
But this round of talks began amid deep divisions between U.S. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin and Mr. Trump's trade advisor, Peter Navarro. Navarro, a China hardliner, reportedly clashed with the more free trader Mnuchin during the first round of talks in Beijing earlier this month. Little progress came from those discussions, but Mnuchin, who's leading this round of U.S. negotiations, has signaled he's eager to cut a deal. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Yamiche Al-Sindor.
The tensions over the U.S.-China relationship are certainly a large component of the administration's trade agenda. The president had wanted to renegotiate NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and get it approved by Congress before the midterm election. The prospects of meeting that timeline seem increasingly unlikely. So let's focus on what is at issue with China. David Lampton is director of the China Studies program at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, and he joins me now. David Lampton, welcome back to the NewsHour. So
Good to be with you.
We hear these comments from the president. We read there's this tension, and yet they're still meeting. How do you size up right now the state of U.S.-China discussions on trade?
Well, I think unless you're involved directly in the talks, there are a lot of moving parts. So we have to admit there's a lot we don't know. But I think the two sides are very far apart. And the aims that the United States has as a matter of broad policy are really rather diametrically opposed to China's desires. And they may end up compromising and just to agree to buy more in the short run. But I think we're very far apart on the fundamental issues.
So we start out very far apart, and you're questioning where we go. What you were telling us before we were talking about this, that you think President Trump has identified correctly some problems with the Chinese and their approach, but you were saying you think he's used some of the wrong tools. What did you mean?
Well, I think the trade deficit is a problem because it reflects barriers to U.S. most competitive industries. China, in effect, has an industrial policy that identifies key sectors for the future: artificial intelligence, electric autos, high-speed railroad. And it's subsidizing firms in those areas. It's creating protectionist walls that keep out competitive firms. It's financing our research and development to a very hefty amount. And the U.S. feels in the aggregate that's disadvantaging us. It gets reflected in the trade deficit, and many of our most competitive firms don't feel they have a level playing field at all operating in China.
Well, I think what's confusing to many people is the president started out, as we mentioned, saying we're going to impose these tough tariffs against China. China turns around and, in effect, punishes some of the U.S. agriculture and other sectors of our economy. So, it's hard to see how we're moving toward coming together.
Right. I think you remember the president said trade wars are easy to win. And I think he believes China's more dependent on us, the United States, than we are on them. But the fact is, the Chinese think our capacity to tolerate pain because we're a democratic society is much less. And they've targeted their retaliation precisely on those parts of the political spectrum that are most vulnerable and most important to President Trump.
They've gone after states, even congressional districts, where it's clear the president needs political support. Let me ask you, David Lampton, about the president, out of the blue, a statement over the weekend that he wanted to do whatever he could to help this giant Chinese telecom company, ZTE, which had earlier been identified as a company that the U.S. should worry about because of potential espionage.
Right.
How are we to read that?
Well, I think this is confusing to almost everybody who's looked at it for trying to find an underlying rationale. The fact of the matter was we sanctioned ZTE because it had violated export controls to Iran and North Korea, among other places. We'd reached an agreement, and the Chinese firm violated that. So this was an enforcement act against specific things, really wasn't part of the trade action. Apparently, President Xi and President Trump talked. He made a request, and then the president sort of seemed to rhetorically fold his hand, which then raises the whole issue of how serious is he? You wouldn't think you want to make a major concession or what could be construed as signaling a concession in the midst of the talks. So I think almost everybody was confused. It sent a bad message on law enforcement.
And it's still unclear, I guess, where that's going to end up. Just remind us, David Lampton, what's at stake here for U.S. agriculture and for some of these big sectors like aircraft, cars and so on?
Well, firms like Boeing, for example, they assemble planes in one location, but parts come from every state in the Union practically. And so when China targets those industries, it's targeting a very broad swath of American society. What else is at stake is prices in Walmart, in Target, for consumer goods, which will most affect many of the people at the lower part of the income spectrum. And so I think you've got an inflationary impact. Also, it will cost jobs, because if we raise the tariff on supplies such as steel and aluminum, then other countries that don't have those tariffs against those inputs will have cheaper prices for their goods. And so I think we are going to lose some employment here.
And we've seen the issues with American allies through all this too.
Right.
Just quickly, what do you think the prospects are at this point that they're going to work something? Could it be that through fits and starts or stumbles of one sort or another, that they come to some kind of useful agreement on trade or not?
Well, I think they will reach some agreement, but it probably won't be dealing with the fundamental issue. And the fundamental issue is, are we going to level the playing field so American competitive firms have access to China? And that's what the business community really wants. The easiest thing that China can do is just use some of its foreign exchange and buy goods without fundamentally changing the terms on which it's doing trade. So my guess is that we'll see some big number for what China's going to purchase, but we won't make as much progress on the fundamental structural issues of the level playing field that we need to make.
David Lampton, thank you very much.
Good to be with you.
Birth rates in the USA have dropped to their lowest annual levels in 3 decades, falling for nearly every group of women, and part of a longer decline that dates back to the Great Recession. Amna Nawaz looks at some of the reasons why this may be happening.
More than 3.8 million babies were born in the United States last year. But last year's drop in the nation's birth rate, about 2% overall, was the largest drop in a single year since 2010. The rate even fell slightly for women in their 30s. And the teen birth rate continued its dramatic nosedive since the early 90s, down 55% since 2007. Last year, the only group to see a higher birth rate was women in their 40s. All this amid some concerns about America's aging population. Hans-Peter Kohler, who studies fertility and birth rates in this country and many others at the University of Pennsylvania, joins me now. Dr. Kohler, thanks so much for making the time. Let me ask you about these numbers now. The lowest number of recorded births in 30 years, the largest single drop since 2010. It paints a pretty grim picture, is it?
So this report is big news, and on the other hand, not all that surprising. So the U.S. stood out among high-income countries as one that had relatively high fertility. And the Great Recession changed that, and across many high-income countries, the recession resulted in declining fertility rates. The really surprising part is that we've now been quite some years through the recession, and unemployment rates is very low, and that trend hasn't changed. So these low fertility rates, despite relatively good economic conditions, are really surprising. I wouldn't argue that they're a disaster or particularly worrisome. I would argue that the U.S. demographics in general continue to be relatively healthy, at least compared to many other high-income countries.
So let's talk about the economic anxiety part of this. Obviously, a lot of people point towards that as a theory why the birth rate declines. But as you mentioned, we're out of a recession now. So how do you look at these numbers? How do you explain this decline?
So presumably a big part is driven by a delay of childbearing. So there have been big declines in teenage fertility rates, and that is good news because that presumably indicates a big decline in unintended or mistimed pregnancies. And across adult ages, that's presumably a delay of childbearing resulting from, on one hand, a desire to have children at later ages, often perhaps pressured by economic stress in early adulthood or high housing prices or desires to actually invest in child quality. And so these trends combined into a pattern where fertility and parenthood is going to be increasingly later. That's going to be across the board, and the U.S. shares this across many high-income countries.
A lot of people sometimes float a theory about immigration playing a role in birth rates increasing or declining. Tell me about that.
I don't think immigration has a big factor in this story. So immigrant fertility adjusts relatively quickly to the U.S. native fertility, and I don't think changes in immigration policy or immigration flows had a big contribution to these recent declines in total fertility rates.
So, Dr. Kohler, tell me about why we care so much about birth rate. Obviously, people will pay attention to these numbers. They'll note these declines. But what do the numbers say about the health or the trajectory of America right now?
Many would see the number of children as an indicator of the well-being of the adult population, from the notion that individuals who are satisfied with their life and have relatively good economic prospects are more likely to have children. The other reason we care about this is that the children born today are obviously the workers 25 years down the road, and are retirees some 60, 70 years down the road. And so the number of births are going to shape the overall size and structure of the U.S. population, and that has a magnitude of implications on both the economic situation and social situation of the United States. So in the long term, if this trend persists, they're going to have profound implication. Any annual number of births probably has relatively small implications.
So, Dr. Kohler, you mentioned these numbers aren't terribly surprising to you. They're also not terribly worrisome right now. At what point do you start to get worried?
Well, if we compare the U.S. to other high-income countries, we could see that fertility could drop a lot lower. So total fertility rates drop to rates like 1.2 in many Southern European countries. They're at these levels in South Korea, and we're at somewhat higher levels in Japan. So on one hand, there's quite a bit of possibility for further declines in fertility. And once we get to very low fertility, or what I have called lowest low fertility at some point, then the kind of implications of rapidly aging populations and possibly declining labor force become very difficult to manage through social policies.
Dr. Hans-Peter Kohler at the University of Pennsylvania, thank you for your time.
You're most welcome.
Now we return to our series Inside Yemen. Tonight, a look at a failed state collapsing because of actions by humans. War has raged since 2015 between Shiite Houthi rebels backed by Iran and Yemen's government backed by a Saudi-led coalition. The Houthis control large areas of Yemen, including the capital, Sana'a. Their conquest reached as far south as the port city of Aden. They were forced from Aden by the coalition, which include the U.S. and the United Arab Emirates. The Emiratis still control the city, which creates friction with Yemen's government. Meantime, the vast majority of Yemen's 29 million people suffer from critical food shortages, a lack of fuel, and a healthcare sector in crisis. Tonight, again in partnership with the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, special correspondent Marcia Biggs reports.
Here in the neonatal ward of Aden's Al-Sadaqa Hospital, mothers take turns looking after their babies, filling in the gaps of a broken health system and a skeleton staff.
So you have 43 babies, and how much staff do you have?
Inez Mohammed Aklan runs the ward, where vital electricity to power incubators and oxygenators comes and goes. Dr. Inez says she loses almost a quarter of the premature babies that arrive to her ward within hours.
This baby was brought in just a week ago, premature. His lungs aren't fully formed yet, so he's in severe respiratory distress. He's just over 3 pounds. Right now, he has oxygen. Today you have electricity.
Yeah.
But tomorrow?
Don't know.
Less than half of Yemen's health facilities are functional, amid a health crisis that has seen epidemics of preventable and largely eradicated diseases, like cholera and diphtheria. Public hospitals exist on few resources, relying on international aid groups for supplies.
All of these medications came from outside.
Yes.
What would you have here if you were only relying on the Ministry of Health?
Empty place.
It would be empty?
Empty, yes. يعني كله نشحت. It feels like we're begging. Everything comes from the aid groups, supplies, teaching. The government is doing nothing.
Yemen's entire infrastructure was badly broken when the war against Houthi rebels began in 2015. Now it's on the brink of collapse. A bankrupt central bank means thousands of public sector workers, doctors, teachers, go with little or no salary for months on end. Civil services have ground to a halt. Gas stations sit abandoned, leaving people to rely on fuel bought on the black market to run their cars and generators. The city is supposed to be liberated, this man shouts. 3 years and nothing has changed. There is no government. We don't get anything from them. And in this Aden market, we meet fisherman Nabil Ahmed, who has had this shop for 11 years.
Without gas, none of us can go to the sea to fish. If I buy gas at these prices, I have to sell the fish at a high price. Sometimes we have to close. We don't work.
More deadly than lack of fuel, lack of food. A Saudi blockade on Yemen's Houthi-controlled north late last year dealt a heavy blow to a country which relies on imports for 90% of its food. 17 million Yemenis, over half the population, don't have enough food to survive.
So here in Aden, it's a big city. There is food available. The problem, the prices. We're going to go talk to some shopkeepers now.
The previous price was 20. Now it's 40.
Bashir Salam says he's had to double some of the prices in his shop.
We used to give normal people goods on credit. They would pay at the end of the month. Now we can't. We tell them you have to pay in cash so I can have cash to keep things running.
Kifa Abdul Kafi says high prices make feeding her family a daily struggle.
Who do you blame?
The government. Who else would we blame? A very corrupt government. There are people who are dying of hunger inside of their houses. They don't dare go out. They don't go out to ask for help, even for medicine. This is too much to handle.
Life here is a grind. Everywhere you go, you see destruction like this. There's been virtually no rebuilding. Trash piles up in the streets. There are open sewage lines. They may have driven the Houthis out of this part of the country, but the official Yemeni government is massively fractured. The result? A failed state.
Ahmed bin Ahmed el-Maisri is Yemen's interior minister, a cabinet member of embattled and exiled President Abdul Rabbu Mansour Hadi.
What do you say to the people who are paying double what they used to pay for food, who don't have fuel, who say that Yemen is a failed state?
Yes, we are suffering, but it's nothing to compare with what the situation was when the Houthis were here. We're still in the negative. Soon we will reach 0 point, and we will go to positive. They have to be patient if they want the truth.
But patience is in short supply. In January of this year, a separatist group backed by the United Arab Emirates stormed the streets of Aden, claiming corruption in the cabinet and demanding that it disband. 3 days of clashes left scores dead, including 7 men assigned to protect Maisri. He says the attackers were puppets of the UAE, which controls the south as part of a Saudi-led coalition formed to fight the Houthis.
We don't regret that Emiratis are here. They helped us. But you can't go to the port without permission from UAE. You can't go to the airport without permission from UAE. You can't enter Aden without the permission of UAE. I, as the Minister of Interior, I don't even have authority over the prisons. What is my value as the Minister of Interior? The coalition originally came to fight Houthis with us. So wherever there are Houthis, the Saudis and the UAE must be there. But once an area is liberated, the legitimate government should be allowed to rule it.
Do you feel occupied? Am I not correct? It sounds like occupation to me.
It's undeclared. We have a lot of indicators on the ground that support what you just said. But we still think good of the UAE. And the answer to your question will come in the next few months. It's either that the coalition countries prove that they came to support the legitimate government and they enable us to do our work, or they will prove the thing that you just said, and I myself will go and say it in a press conference, but not now.
But these women will say they feel occupied.
How old is he? 65 years old.
Mohammed Saleh is one of hundreds believed to be held in secret prisons run by the UAE and its proxy forces. He was taken 6 months ago from his home by police, allegedly on charges of terrorism, and disappeared without a trace. His sister Miriam comes every week to protest with other family members, desperate for information.
We're not even allowed to go to the coalition offices to ask about our family members. Did they come to help us get rid of the Houthis or destroy us? This is a crime. We're humans, not animals.
We asked the representative of the newly reopened Ministry of Human Rights about the status of the detained.
The courts have been closed for 2.5 years because of the war, and they just reopened 6 months ago. Now that they are open, things will get better. The coalition security used to say that they can't release any suspects because with no courts, there could not be a trial.
Did you hear anything back?
The UAE officially denies their use of secret prisons, but the Minister of Interior tells us otherwise. He says he was in talks with the UAE on behalf of these families, but the attack on his government in January shut down communication. Hanan's husband Rami has been detained for over a year and a half.
The Yemeni government has no control over Yemen. This is our country, but the coalition treat us like slaves in our own country. They are occupying us. They have helped us once, and we thank them, but they need to leave.
Here in the south, the silence of stalemate is a far cry from the scream of airstrikes in the north. And life goes on amid the rubble of yesterday's war, with little hope for tomorrow. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Marcia Biggs in Aden, Yemen.
For the past few weeks, we've been reporting on the spread of misleading, false, or hyper-partisan news on social media. And last night, Miles O'Brien took a look at what Facebook is doing to crack down on what he calls junk news. Tonight, our economics correspondent, Paul Salman, talks to a Silicon Valley visionary who thinks we should do away with social media entirely. It's part of our weekly series, Making Sense, which airs Thursdays on the NewsHour.
When it comes to social media, computer scientist and virtual reality pioneer Jaron Lanier doesn't mince words.
Anything you do on Facebook is fundamentally hopeless, so I won't go on it myself.
Lanier, who's also an offbeat musician, has been sounding a discordant note about social networks for years. His latest book is 10 arguments for deleting your social media accounts right now. His core concern is an economic one.
The economic problem is very simply that we've designed a society where if you and I talk over social media, the only way that can happen is if it's for the benefit of a third party who's paying for it, and their only possible benefit is getting us to change our behavior.
To get us to buy, that is, goods, services, but most perniciously, ideologies.
So it becomes a society based fundamentally on sneaky manipulation. Everybody has hired a hypnotist who they don't know, who's being paid by people they don't know, for purposes they don't know. There's sort of a cognitive extortion racket now where the idea is that, you know what, nobody's going to know about your book, nobody's going to know about your store, nobody's going to know about your candidacy unless you're putting money into these social network things.
All that information we share about ourselves online, Lanier argues, is not only used to sell us stuff, but to manipulate our civic behavior in uncivilly destabilizing ways. Just look at the spread of fake news and the Cambridge Analytica scandal.
In the last presidential election in the US, what we saw was targeted nihilism or cynicism, conspiracy theories, paranoia, negativity at voter groups that parties were trying to suppress. The thing about negativity is it comes up faster, it's cheaper to generate, and it lingers longer. So for instance, it takes a long time to build trust, but you can lose trust very quickly.
Right, always easier to destroy than to build.
So the thing is, since these systems are based on really quick feedback, negativity is more efficient, cheaper, more effective. So if you want to turn an election, for instance, you don't do it with positivity about your candidate, you do it with negativity about the other candidate.
Lanier says smartphones and smart speakers are now being used to modify our behavior on a titanic scale, without our informed consent.
what you see is being calculated carefully based on measurements about you, about your interests, the timing. The companies claim they can tell all kinds of things about your psychological state, your state of health, all kinds of things. And all of this is used to place ads and content in front of you that will have some predetermined effect on you.
But I get these ads all the time for chairs that my wife had looked at a while ago, or singles, you know. I get all these ads for singles. And I go, please, it has absolutely no effect on me at all.
So we're dealing with statistical effect. So let's say I take 1 million people, and for each of them I have this online dossier that's been created by observing them in detail for years through their phones. And then I send out messages that are calculated to, for instance, make them a little cynical on election day if they were tending to vote for a candidate I don't like. I can say, without knowing exactly which people I influenced, let's say 10% became 3% less likely to vote because I got them confused and bummed out and cynical. It's a slight thing, but here's something about slight changes. When you have slight changes that you can predict well and you can use them methodically, you can actually make big changes.
So the people who are sending me pictures of chairs because they saw that my wife had bought a couple, they wouldn't be doing it if some people weren't responding.
Well, it's even a little sneakier than that, because, for instance, they might be sending you notifications about single services because statistically people who are in the same grouping with you get a little annoyed about that, and that engages them a little bit more.
Oh, really?
Oh, sure, absolutely. And it's not...
So I am annoyed. So you mean they're having the desired effect?
It might have caused you to click a little bit further and then see some other ad that had an influence on you. So it might actually be having its desired effect. Now, I want to make something clear. There's nobody sitting at a cubicle in Facebook or Twitter anywhere who's saying, oh, we're gonna get that Paul with the singles ad. This is all statistical. It pulls you in a little bit more. It's a funny thing. It's a little bit like, have you ever known someone who always is just on the edge of annoying you, but you can't quite understand them, and in a way you're drawn in more and more to try to get that person?
Yes, I had a very good friend like that.
That's Facebook.
Annoying, but compelling in a...
Yeah, because your brain is trying to solve the puzzle. This is the magic of inconsistent feedback. It's not a simple matter of the dog hits the button and gets the candy, hits the button, gets the candy. Once in a while, a clever trainer actually withholds the candy bit, so the dog becomes, wait, what do I have to do to get that candy?
Come on, Hugo.
Social media, says Lanier, have turned us into trained dogs.
Good boy.
But he thinks we'd be better off as cats, who prize their independence.
You can put a cat out somewhere and they'll fend for themselves. And that sense of integrating modernity with independence is, I think, what every person seeks and is harder and harder to get at, but cats have it.
So how to become a cat? Lanier has long argued that we have to force the social media business model to change, insisting companies should be paid by users instead of third-party advertisers. Subscription instead of supposedly free TV.
So we have services like Netflix, Amazon Prime, HBO. TV got better by almost universal acclaim when people were willing to pay for it. And so what's going on here is that when the user is also the customer, all of a sudden what that user gets is better because they're the customer.
But is this for everyone? As Facebook Chief Operating Officer Sheryl Sandberg argued to Judy Woodruff recently, internet advertising is essential for a mass medium.
It's what enables us to make this product available to people all around the world for free. 2 billion people use the product. If it weren't advertising based, most of those people would not be able to.
Lanier's retort?
This idea that you allowing the whole society to be run by a manipulative scheme is the only way to not be elitist. It's got to be one of the most cynical and sort of cruel-minded arguments going right now. I mean, it's ridiculous.
Which is why Lanier vows not to have a social media account until he can pay for it, and says you and I shouldn't either. Please forgive me then for not having checked my Making Sense Facebook page in weeks.
This is aloof.
The PBS NewsHour. This is economics correspondent Paul Solman in Berkeley, California.
It was a moment that changed America. 55 years ago this month, thousands of African-American children walked out of their schools and began a peaceful march in Birmingham, Alabama, to protest segregation. They were met with attack dogs and water hoses. The disturbing images shocked the nation and became the catalyst for the Civil Rights Act. This moment in history has now come alive for a group of students who traveled to Birmingham. Special correspondent Lisa Stark of our partner Education Week went along with them as part of our series, Race Matters.
Everywhere that I went, this is what I always saw: colored and white.
These 5th and 6th graders are mesmerized.
Our restaurants, our dentist's office, our doctor's office, everywhere that we went, this is what we always saw when I was your age.
John Alexander and Charles Avery grew up in the segregated South.
My dad asked me, what is your greatest ambition in life, son? I said, to drink out of that water fountain, talking about that white water fountain. We just wanted to know what it tastes like.
For those listening, these stories are now much more than just a chapter in a history book. Here's Amari and Avion.
They use the word I, as in like their, like themselves. So you're actually looking at the person.
We get to hear their perspective on it because nobody can tell their story better than the person who actually experienced it.
We believe in the power of immersion and the power of bringing history to life for our students.
Francesca Peck is the Director of Culture and Character for the Polaris Charter Academy in Chicago, a school with an in-depth curriculum that stresses first-hand learning.
Let's come immerse ourselves, let's come experience it, let's come to the primary source and get a feel of what it was like to live at that time.
To do that, these Chicago 5th and 6th graders traveled 10 hours and more than 600 miles from Illinois to Alabama.
Welcome to Birmingham, ladies and gentlemen. Give yourselves a round of applause. We have made it.
Birmingham, the site of the 1963 Children's Crusade. Thousands of young black students left their classrooms to march against segregation. These students are here to examine and record their own thoughts on what transpired back then and why. This class visit to Birmingham isn't a field trip, it's field work, and it puts the students right at the center of their own research project. It comes after a year of preparation in the classroom, studying the civil rights movement.
And they were singing one word over and over.
They have watched documentaries.
Don't worry about your children, they're going to be all right.
Analyzed photographs.
What are they trying to accomplish?
They're trying to accomplish their freedom. They're trying to earn what they work for.
Dissected first-hand accounts and studied the arc of civil rights history. Polaris Charter Academy is largely African American and low income. The school's mission includes instilling a sense of activism and social justice.
It's not just enough that children are critical thinkers and that children are producing high quality work and that they are of like great character, but really that they see themselves as agents of change in their community.
So they're here retracing steps child activists took 55 years ago, visiting the 16th Street Baptist Church, where marchers gathered.
Being inside of it made me feel kind of excited, because like I knew that Martin Luther King was in that same exact spot, in that same exact place.
Studying the memorials in the park, where authorities decades ago unleashed dogs and water hoses against the protesters.
I feel like, how does this make you feel? Angry. Tell me more, why?
The white people want the dogs to bite humans, and they're not treating humans as humans.
They teach people in kindergarten that everyone is equal and like to just be kind, and that the fact that they were so brutal to African Americans is not okay.
They're confronting some of the most frightening symbols of the time and meeting men and women who were young students themselves when they marched for equal rights.
It's your first time in Birmingham? Okay, we got something to show you.
Janice Kelsey was 16 during what became known as the Children's Crusade.
And we sang, "We Shall Overcome." And we walked out in pairs, and we were stopped by police officers who told us, you stay in this line, you're going to jail. I had already made up my mind I was going to jail. And that's exactly where I went for 4 days.
So this is holy ground. All of this, young people, all of this is where it all happened.
Raymond Goolsby was 17 at the time and recalls his fear waiting in the 16th Street Baptist Church to begin the march.
Now, my group was the first group out, and I'm sitting there shaking like a leaf on a tree in the building before we walked out. And I said, man, I don't know what I want to do. There's all these Billy Club police standing out there with the Billy Club.
The stark images from that time, now memorialized, shocked the nation, leading to a fierce backlash. Birmingham leaders buckled, releasing the students from jail and agreeing to begin desegregation.
I feel thankful for the people that went through all this, because if they would never went through it, that means I would have to went through it. And I know from me right now, I wouldn't be that brave enough to do what they did.
4 months later, angry white supremacists would place a bomb at the 16th Street Baptist Church, killing 4 young girls, including Cynthia Wesley, Janice Kelsey's close friend.
Because she gave up her life for things that I believed in, then I agreed to talk about it to young people so that you will know what it took to get to where we are.
Today, of course, Birmingham is a very different city, the nation a different place. But these students are encouraged to connect the past with the present.
We are here to answer the question, how do members of a community affect change?
If you guys could march today, what would you march for?
Well, one I would march for gun violence, and I'll also march for justice.
What about you? What would you march for today?
I'll march for the same things: less peace and gun violence, so people can stop killing each other.
Many of these students live in neighborhoods touched by violence.
We need to make a difference, but it's just can really one person make a difference in the world?
Some people don't believe that kids can actually make a change, but I believe kids can actually make a change.
With encouragement from those who have come before.
What you got to do is study hard. Come and you'll be able to compete for whatever you want to do. The sky's the limit with you young people. The sky is the limit.
A future shaped by those early civil rights activists.
I'll definitely remember it because it's part of my history, because it's a part of people who are like me, and it's our story. And this generation, they have to decide on whether they're going to make a story like that this generation did.
For the PBS NewsHour and Education Week, I'm Lisa Stark in Birmingham, Alabama.
Next, our weekly brief but spectacular series where people talk about their passions. Monica McGinnis and Aaron Rodriguez spent 2 years traveling 80 miles to a hospital in Oakland, California, so their 8-year-old son, Devin, could receive treatment for cancer. They share their experiences with us tonight.
Devin is my son. He's 8 years old, and he is the brightest little boy ever.
It was beginning in April. It was about a week
before the hospital.
Before the hospital trip. I got out the shower and I seen him trying to use the restroom, and it was hard for him. And then I told her, make a doctor's appointment because I think he has a UTI.
Mm-hmm.
So they did the ultrasound, and that's when
they found the mass. But they didn't know what the mass was until we went to Children's Hospital Oakland by ambulance, and then we stayed the night there. And then the very next day, they told us Devin was going to go in for a biopsy. And, he went in for his biopsy. And after that, they let us know that Devin was diagnosed with stage 4 embryonal rhabdomyosarcoma. He took the diagnosis, I guess, very well. I guess he didn't really understand. He just knew he was going to be,
that he was sick.
That he was sick and he was going to get bald.
It was really serious that he can actually die from it. And that was the hardest thing to tell my son.
Yeah.
He just got quiet and just took it all in.
Yeah.
And he's a really strong little boy.
He is.
And he took it to heart, and that's the day he started fighting. It was very hard. Just to see my son Just when I thought cancer, I thought all I heard was death.
His first question was, is my son going to die?
That was, because everybody hears cancer and everyone thinks death.
Yeah.
We spent his birthday, New Year's, Christmas, Halloween, Easter, every holiday, birthday we spent at the hospital.
They really made him feel comfortable, which made us feel at ease as well, because when Devin is feeling good, we are feeling good.
What do you have to say to other parents who are going through what you went through?
I can handle it one way. As you can see, I'm a crier, and she holds back.
And plus, you can't really find somebody's silver lining for them. You know, you can't say, oh, everything's going to be okay, or they're resilient. You know, we as parents don't want to hear that. This is our child. He shouldn't have to be going through this. He should be playing Little League, and he should be going to school instead of having to take the year off to get chemo, you know. Try to explain to all of your loved ones and family members and friends what exactly childhood cancer is and what you go through as parents.
As of 3 weeks ago, Devin is no signs of cancer. So he's
back in school. He's doing really good. Fighting with his brothers and sisters, you know.
Getting on our nerves.
It's changed my life by appreciating my kids, or Devin, even in the bad times when he's on my nerves, because I missed that the whole time when he was going through treatment. My name is Monica McGinnis.
I'm Aaron Rodriguez.
And this is our brief but spectacular take
on childhood cancer.
And we are so happy to hear that Devin is doing really well. And you can watch additional brief but spectacular episodes on our website, pbs.org/newshour/brief. The nation's largest youth development organization, 4-H, has been preparing young people for careers in agriculture and farming for over 100 years. As part of the NewsHour's Student Reporting Lab series, Making It Work, Alexis Lesher and a team of students at Cedar Crest High School in Lebanon, Pennsylvania, report on how one hard-working 15-year-old turned a swine project into a profitable business.
If you happen to stop by Grumbine's Berkshires and Farm, you'll be surprised at who greets you. Business owner Dakota Grumbine is only 15 years old. He started the business as a 4-H project when he was just 8, but it didn't get off to a smooth start.
When I first started off, I didn't really have any luck as far as the breeding standpoint goes. I couldn't get pigs settled. The litters were small. Not many of them had a second litter, or they just didn't work out. So it took me a while to get a sow base built up.
Dakota now has 20 sow, 4 boars, and almost 200 customers. He breeds pasture-raised Berkshire pigs, which command a higher price, over $1 more per pound than regular commercial pork.
There's a lot more management involved, as opposed to when I had 5 sows, where I knew all the sows off the top of my head, their ear notches and everything. Now I gotta write that down or keep track of it somewhere, because I can't remember all of that information anymore.
Dakota created a website about his product and sells to butcher shops and restaurants. He has traveled as far as Illinois, Iowa, and Ohio to learn more about the business. His father has also helped him with the business and says that it's beneficial that Dakota has started so young.
The younger you are when you start something, the easier it is to pick it up. I see other kids don't enjoy certain opportunities such as public speaking and talking to strangers. He did that stuff at such a young age that now he doesn't even really think about some of those things that hold a lot of kids back.
He goes to school 7 hours a day for 5 days a week like any other student. But when he gets home, he has to do his homework while still keeping enough time to manage his pigs.
He balances it pretty well. He does well in school, and he has some things that he does for fun that he really enjoys.
Dakota's business is starting to pay off financially, too. He makes an annual profit which is increasing each year.
Even if I don't continue raising hogs for the rest of my life, it's experience at a young age of coming home every day and having responsibility. I can walk away with a lot of different assets as far as management and time management, money management, you name it. The farming industry, and especially the hog industry, encompasses a lot of things that I'll be able to use later on in life.
For the PBS NewsHour Student Reporting Labs, this is Alexis Lesher in Lebanon, Pennsylvania.
And what an impressive young man Dakota is. On the NewsHour Online right now, President Trump may be closer to a sit-down interview with special counsel Robert Mueller. White House correspondent Yamiche Alcindor reports that the president's lead lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, says that Mueller's team is narrowing possible questions for Mr. Trump and says the prospect of talks look more hopeful than it did a day or so ago. That and more is on our website, pbs.org/newshour. And that's the NewsHour for tonight. I'm Judy Woodruff. Join us online and again here tomorrow evening with the analysis of the week's news with Mark Shields and David Brooks. For all of us at the PBS NewsHour, thank you, and we'll see you soon.
Major funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by
Knowledge. It's where innovation begins. It's what leads us to discovery and motivates us to succeed. It's why we ask the tough questions and what leads us to the answers. At Leidos, we're standing behind those working to improve the world's health, safety, and efficiency. Leidos.
Kevin.
Kevin.
Advice for life. Life well planned. Learn more at RaymondJames.com.
Babbel, a language app that teaches real-life conversations in a new language like Spanish, French, German, Italian, and more. Babbel's 10 to 15-minute lessons are available as an app or online. More information on Babbel.com.
Consumer Cellular. And with the ongoing support of these institutions.
You're watching PBS.